Mason gives a quote to a 75-year-old lady, but upon hearing her name he despairs. She was his stepmother who caused his family estrangement. The persistent drizzle of Manchester's autumn morning matched Marcus Thompson's mood as he navigated his weathered white van through the narrow streets of Didsbury. At 47, his calloused hands gripped the steering wheel with the same strength they wielded his mason's tools, a strength built over decades of laying bricks and shaping stone. The radio hummed quietly, playing classic British rock that barely registered in his consciousness as he contemplated the day ahead. His mobile buzzed on the passenger seat. Another job request. Marcus typically wouldn't check messages while driving, but something compelled him to pull over beneath the shelter of an old oak tree. The message was simple. Need quote for garden wall repair. 15 Willow Lane. He knew the area well. It was near his childhood home, a place he hadn't visited in 15 years. The coincidence stirred memories he'd rather keep buried. 15 years since he'd last spoken to his father. 15 years since Sarah, his stepmother, had come between them. The weight of those years pressed against his chest like the heavy stones he worked with daily. His small flat above the hardware shop in Rusholme held no photographs from before the estrangement. The only remnants of his past life were tucked away in a shoebox beneath his bed. His father's old mechanic's certificate, a family photo from his mother's last Christmas, and a handful of birthday cards from his son, James, who'd been just 7 when everything fell apart. The rain intensified as Marcus pulled up to Willow Lane. The Victorian houses stood proud despite their age, their gardens neat despite the weather. Number 15 appeared at the end of the row, its front garden a masterpiece of roses and climbing vines, even in the autumn gloom. Something about the careful arrangement of the flowers tugged at his memory. Marcus gathered his notepad and tape measure, pulling his jacket collar up against the rain. As he approached the gate, he noticed the brass knocker on the dark green door, identical to the one his father had installed in their family home all those years ago. The door opened before he could knock. Marcus found himself face to face with Sarah Thompson, his stepmother. She had aged, her once auburn hair now silver, but her green eyes remained sharp as ever. They widened in recognition, her hand flying to her mouth. "Marcus?" Her voice trembled. The world seemed to stop. The rain faded to white noise as memories flooded back. Sunday roasts that grew increasingly tense, arguments about the garage's finances, Sarah's insistence that Marcus was pulling his father away from their new marriage. The final argument that had driven him away. Words thrown like stones, leaving wounds that had never properly healed. I should go," Marcus managed, turning back toward his van. "Please," Sarah called out, her voice catching. "The wall really does need fixing. And perhaps other things do too." Marcus stopped, rain running down his neck. He thought of his empty flat, of the years spent building walls not just with stone, but around his heart. He thought of James, now 22, who occasionally sent messages that Marcus struggled to answer, knowing they carried the weight of his grandson's questions about family history. "The wall," he said finally, turning back. "Show me what needs doing." Sarah stepped aside, allowing him into the house. The hallway smelled of cinnamon and coffee, so familiar it made his throat tight. Through the kitchen window, he could see the garden wall, partially collapsed after the recent storms. But it was the photograph on the wall that caught his eye. His father, younger and smiling, working on a car in his beloved garage. "He still asks about you," Sarah said quietly, following his gaze. "Every Sunday dinner." Marcus's hand tightened around his tape measure. "Sunday dinners?" "Yes, he comes round every week. He'll be here this weekend." Sarah busied herself with the kettle, her hands shaking slightly. "I've made so many mistakes, Marcus. That wall isn't the only thing that needs mending." The rain continued its steady pattern against the windows as Marcus stood in his stepmother's kitchen, 15 years of distance stretching between them like a vast sea. Yet somehow in that moment, the first brick in that invisible wall began to crumble. The wall would take 3 days to repair properly. Marcus knew this within minutes of his inspection, but he found himself stretching the estimate to 5 days, each word carefully measured as he wrote up the quote at Sarah's kitchen table. The coffee she'd made him had grown cold, forgotten as they navigated the delicate conversation between them. The original mortar wasn't mixed properly, Marcus explained, focusing on the technical aspects to steady his voice. That's why it failed in the storm. We'll need to start fresh with the foundation. Sarah nodded, understanding the double meaning in his words. Your father always said you had an eye for detail. He was so proud when you started your own business. Marcus looked up sharply. He knew about that? We've followed your progress, Marcus. The community center you helped renovate in Chorlton, the historical restoration work in the northern quarter. Sarah pulled out a folder from a nearby drawer filled with newspaper clippings about local construction projects. James helped us find your company website too. The mention of his son's name made Marcus's heart constrict. You've been in touch with James? He visits sometimes, brings little Sophie round. Sarah smiled softly. She's beautiful, Marcus. Just turned 3. She has your mother's eyes. Marcus set down his pen, the quote forgotten. He had a granddaughter he'd never met. James had tried to tell him about the pregnancy, but Marcus had been too afraid to engage, too worried about the past repeating itself. Now, sitting in Sarah's kitchen, the weight of everything he'd missed pressed against him. The garage, Sarah said suddenly, pulling out another folder. We've been thinking of selling it. Your father can't manage the work anymore, and it's just sitting there gathering dust, but perhaps... She hesitated, then pushed forward. Perhaps you might have some ideas for it. Marcus remembered the garage well. It had been his childhood playground, where he'd learned to use tools alongside his father, where he'd first discovered his love for building and creating. The thought of it being sold to strangers made something twist in his chest. What sort of ideas? Well, you've built such a successful business, and there are so many young people looking to learn trades these days. Sarah's eyes lit up with enthusiasm. Your father always said the garage had good bones. With your expertise in construction, and perhaps James's knowledge of technology, the possibility hung in the air between them, fragile as a soap bubble. Marcus found himself standing, walking to the kitchen window. The rain had finally stopped, and weak sunlight illuminated the garden. Despite the collapsed wall, the space was beautiful. Roses climbing trellises, herbs in neat beds, a small pond reflecting the clearing sky. You did all this? He asked, gesturing to the garden. Sarah joined him at the window. After you left, I needed something to focus on, something to build. Every plant represents a prayer for reconciliation, for healing. She touched a rose bush gently. These were your mother's favorites. I planted them to honor her memory, to remind myself that I was meant to add to this family, not divide it. Marcus felt tears prickling at the corners of his eyes. He remembered his mother's rose garden, how she'd taught him that anything worth growing needed patience, care, and sometimes a bit of pruning. He thought of his own son, now a father himself, and of all the growth he'd missed. The garage, he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. It would need extensive renovation. New wiring, proper insulation, maybe skylights for natural light. We could create workspaces, a classroom area perhaps. Sarah's hand found his arm, tentative but warm. Your father will be here on Sunday. He'd love to hear these ideas, Marcus. We all would. The afternoon light caught the silver in Sarah's hair, and Marcus saw not the woman who had once seemed to threaten his place in the family, but someone who had kept his memory alive, who had cultivated hope like the roses in her garden, someone who, despite everything, had never given up on the possibility of renewal. Sunday, he agreed, turning back to the quote on the table. But first, let's sort out this wall. Proper foundations take time to set. The following days passed in a blur of mortar and stone as Marcus worked on Sarah's garden wall. Each morning, she would bring him tea in a familiar blue mug, the same pattern his mother had collected years ago. They spoke little, but the silence between them grew increasingly comfortable, punctuated by the rhythmic sound of his trowel and the occasional burst of birdsong from the garden. By Sunday morning, the wall stood complete, its fresh stonework a testament to Marcus's craftsmanship. He had deliberately saved the final touches for Monday, giving himself an excuse to return after what promised to be an emotionally charged day. As he parked his van outside Sarah's house, his hands trembled slightly on the steering wheel. The street was quiet, save for the distant chime of church bells. A silver Vauxhall sat in the driveway, his father's car. Marcus recognized it despite its age, remembering countless hours spent helping to maintain it in the garage. Taking a deep breath, he approached the front door. This time, it was James who opened it. His son stood before him, tall and composed in a navy jumper, looking so much like Marcus's younger self that it made his heart ache. Behind James, a small girl with curly brown hair peeked out, clutching a stuffed elephant. "Dad," James said simply, then stepped forward to embrace him. The gesture, unexpected and warm, broke something loose in Marcus's chest. He hugged his son back fiercely, breathing in the scent of his hair, somehow still the same as when he was small. "You must be Sophie," Marcus managed, kneeling down to his granddaughter's level once James released him. The little girl studied him seriously, then held out her elephant for inspection. "This is Trunk," she announced. "He helps build things too." James chuckled. "She insisted on bringing him when we told her granddad was a builder." He glanced at Marcus. "I hope that's okay, calling you that." Marcus could only nod, his throat too tight for words. Sarah appeared in the hallway, ushering them toward the kitchen where Sunday roast smells brought back a flood of memories. And there, standing by the window with his hands in his pockets, was George Thompson. His father had aged, his once dark hair now completely grey, his tall frame slightly stooped. But his eyes were the same, warm brown and full of emotion as they met Marcus's. For a long moment, father and son stared at each other across 15 years of silence. "The wall looks good," George said finally, his voice gruff. "Proper craftsmanship." "I learned from the best," Marcus replied quietly. "You always said foundation matters most." George nodded, then crossed the room in 3 quick strides to pull Marcus into a fierce hug. "I've missed you, son," he whispered, his voice breaking. "So bloody much." The Sunday roast that followed was unlike any meal Marcus had experienced in years. Sophie insisted on sitting beside him, sharing elaborate stories about Trunk's building adventures. James spoke about his work in web development, his wife Emma, who was away at a conference, and their life in Manchester's suburbs. Sarah and George took turns filling in the gaps of the years Marcus had missed, carefully navigating around the old wounds. As Sarah served apple crumble, his mother's recipe she mentioned softly, George cleared his throat. "Sarah tells me you've seen the garage plans." Marcus set down his spoon. "Just ideas, Dad. Nothing concrete." "Show him," Sarah encouraged, retrieving the folder they'd discussed days earlier. "Please, Marcus, tell him what you envision." Slowly at first, then with growing animation, Marcus outlined his thoughts for transforming the old garage. He spoke of modernizing the space while preserving its character, creating areas for practical training alongside computer stations for technical learning. James leaned forward, adding suggestions about online courses and virtual reality training modules. "A place where experience meets innovation," George mused, studying the rough sketches Marcus had made. "Where old hands can teach newcomers and young minds can bring new ideas." He looked up at his son. "It's exactly what the trade needs." "We could call it Thompson's Training Center," Sophie announced proudly, making the adults laugh. "Actually," Sarah said, "I've been looking into the legal requirements for educational facilities. With my accounting background, I could handle the business side. And George, your connections in the industry. And I could develop the website, handle the digital marketing," James added. "Emma's company might even be interested in partnering. They're always looking for skilled contractors." Marcus looked around the table at his family, the father he'd missed so desperately, the stepmother who'd kept his memory alive, the son who'd grown into a remarkable man, and the granddaughter he was just beginning to know. The air hummed with possibility. "There's just one thing," George said seriously. "The garage needs a proper inspection first." "Want to come take a look after lunch, son?" Marcus nodded, understanding this was about more than just examining the building. It was about returning to where everything had begun, and perhaps where something new could start. The old garage stood exactly as Marcus remembered it, yet somehow smaller. The familiar scent of motor oil and metal greeted them as George unlocked the heavy doors, sunlight streaming through dusty windows to illuminate the workspace where Marcus had spent so much of his youth. Tool shadows still marked the pegboard wall where equipment had once hung in precise order. The hydraulic lift sat silent in the center, its blue paint chipped, but its structure sound. In the corner, Marcus spotted his old workbench, the one George had built for him on his 12th birthday. "You kept it," he said softly, running his hand along the scarred wood. "Couldn't bear to shift it," George replied. "Always hoped." He cleared his throat. "Well, looks like that hope wasn't wasted." They moved through the space methodically, father and son falling into an old rhythm as they assessed the building's condition. Marcus noted areas needing attention. The roof would need reinforcement, the electrical system required updating, and the concrete floor showed signs of wear. Yet the building's bones remained strong, its potential obvious to his experienced eye. "Sarah blamed herself, you know," George said suddenly, pausing by the old parts storage shelves. "After you left. Took her years to tell me about the things she'd said to you." Marcus tensed, remembering that final argument. "She was scared I was pulling you away from her, from your new marriage." "Aye, she was. Lost her first husband young, you see. Made her terrified of losing everything again." George sighed heavily. "And I was no help, too caught up in trying to make everyone happy to see how things were falling apart. I could have tried harder to understand," Marcus admitted. "Could have stayed in touch with James at least. We all made mistakes, son. The question is, what do we do now?" Marcus walked to the windows, wiping away years of dust to let in more light. Through the cleared glass, he could see Sarah's garden next door, the newly repaired wall strong and true. James stood there with Sophie, showing her the roses while Sarah looked on, smiling. "I think," Marcus said slowly, "we build something new, together." They spent the next hour mapping out possibilities, their excitement growing as they explored the space. The old office could become a classroom, the parts room transformed into a computer lab. The main workspace would remain a practical training area, updated with modern equipment, but maintaining its essential character. "We could start small," Marcus suggested. "Weekend workshops at first, seeing what the community needs. Basic maintenance courses," George added. "Proper building techniques. Safety certifications. And then expand into longer programs," James called from the doorway where he'd appeared with Sophie on his shoulders. "We could develop online resources, create a proper curriculum." Sophie wriggled down from her father's shoulders and ran to the workbench, Trunk the elephant clutched firmly in one hand. "Can I have a bench too?" she asked seriously. "For me and Trunk to build things?" Marcus lifted her onto the worn wood surface, remembering how his father had done the same for him countless times. "I think we can arrange that, love. Every builder needs a proper workspace." Sarah appeared with a tray of tea, setting it on a dusty counter. "I've been thinking about the business plan," she said. "We could apply for educational grants, perhaps partner with local schools." As they gathered around drinking tea from mismatched mugs, Marcus felt the years of separation beginning to dissolve. The garage that had once been a source of conflict now offered a chance for healing, for building not just walls and buildings but bridges between generations. "You know," George said thoughtfully, "your mother always said you'd do something special with your skills, Marcus. Something more than just laying bricks." "She was right about most things," Marcus replied, watching Sophie arrange her toy tools on his old workbench, especially about family being the strongest foundation of all. The afternoon light slanted through the newly cleaned windows, illuminating dust motes that danced like possibilities in the air. In that moment, surrounded by 3 generations of Thompsons, Marcus understood that sometimes the longest journeys could lead you right back home, not to the place you left, but to something better, something built with wisdom, forgiveness, and love. The transformation of Thompson's garage began on a crisp October morning, 3 weeks after that pivotal Sunday reunion. Marcus arrived early, watching his breath cloud in the autumn air as he unlocked the building. The interior felt different now, cleared of decades of accumulated tools and parts, ready for its new purpose. James had already set up a temporary office in the old customer waiting area, his laptop surrounded by architectural drawings and permit applications. The father and son had spent countless evening hours refining the plans, their shared vision growing clearer with each discussion. "Morning, Dad," James called out, barely looking up from his screen. "The building inspector's coming at 10. Sarah's bringing the paperwork from the council." Marcus smiled at his son's focused expression, so reminiscent of his own when deep in a project. Their relationship was healing through shared purpose, bridging the gap of lost years through technical discussions and quiet cups of tea shared over blueprints. The sound of a car pulling up outside drew their attention. George emerged from his Vauxhall, carrying a cardboard box of old photographs and documents. "Thought these might be useful for the website," he explained, setting them down carefully. "Show people the heritage behind the place." Sarah arrived moments later, her arms full of official-looking folders. Sophie skipped alongside her, clutching her ever-present elephant and wearing a toy hard hat that Marcus had bought her the previous weekend. "Grandad!" she exclaimed, running to him. "Trunk and I are ready to help build." Marcus scooped her up, settling her on his hip with practiced ease. "Well then, Miss Sophie, shall we show the inspector your special workbench when he arrives?" The building inspection passed smoothly, their careful planning paying off. The inspector, an older man named Harold, nodded approvingly at their detailed proposals for updating the space while maintaining its structural integrity. "Good to see a family business evolving instead of closing down," he remarked, signing off on the preliminary permits. "Too many old places getting turned into luxury flats these days." As Harold left, Sarah spread the approved plans across James's makeshift desk. "Right then," she said, her accountant's precision showing in her neat annotations. "We can begin the basic renovations immediately. I've scheduled the electrician for next week and the new windows will arrive in a fortnight." George studied the timeline she'd created. "The old lift can come out tomorrow. Marcus, reckon you could get some of your crew in to help. Heavy work, that." "Already arranged," Marcus replied. "My team's eager to be involved. They've been asking about teaching opportunities once we're up and running." The day passed in a blur of activity. James set up the website's basic framework, incorporating the old garage photos George had brought. Sarah worked on grant applications, occasionally asking Marcus and George to clarify technical details. Sophie supervised from her workbench, providing running commentary to Trunk about proper building techniques. Late afternoon found them gathered around a pot of tea, reviewing their progress. The space already felt different, lighter, full of possibility. The pegboard wall, cleared of its ancient tools, awaited new equipment. The floor had been marked out with bright tape, showing where the training stations would be positioned. "Emma's coming home tomorrow," James mentioned, scrolling through his phone. "She's excited about the project. Her firm's already talking about sending their junior contractors here for additional training." Sarah looked up from her paperwork. "That reminds me. I've been thinking about the marketing strategy. We should emphasize the blend of traditional skills and modern techniques. George's experience combined with James's technical knowledge and Marcus's expertise in sustainable building practices," George added. "The industry's changing, but good craftsmanship never goes out of style." Marcus watched his family planning and dreaming together, each contributing their unique strengths to the project. Sophie had fallen asleep on his lap, Trunk clutched tightly in her small hands. The sight of her peaceful face reminded him of James at that age, full of curiosity and trust. "We'll need to think about accessibility," he said softly, careful not to wake his granddaughter. "Proper ramps, wider doorways. Make sure everyone feels welcome here." James nodded, adding notes to his laptop. "We could install adjustable height workstations too. And maybe create some online modules for people who can't attend in person." "Your mother would have loved this," George remarked quietly to Marcus. "She always said a family business should serve the community, not just itself." Sarah reached across the table, squeezing Marcus's hand. "She'll be part of it too," she said. "Those roses from her garden, I've taken cuttings. They'll line the new pathway to the entrance." As the autumn sun began to set, casting long shadows through the dusty windows, Marcus felt a deep sense of rightness settle over him. The old garage, which had once symbolized his loss of family connection, was becoming a bridge between past and future, between generations and traditions. Sophie stirred in his lap, blinking sleepily. "Is our school ready yet, Grandad?" "Not yet, love," he answered, smoothing her curls. "But we're building it together, brick by brick, just like all the best things in life." The weeks flew by in a whirlwind of construction and planning. November brought steady rain and shorter days, but work continued steadily on the garage's transformation. Marcus split his time between his regular contracts and overseeing the renovation, often working late into the evening under temporary floodlights. Emma, James's wife, proved to be an invaluable addition to the team. Her experience in corporate construction management brought a fresh perspective to their planning. She sat with Sarah for hours, developing comprehensive training programs that would appeal to both individual tradespeople and larger companies. "We need to think beyond just technical skills," Emma explained one evening as the family gathered for their now regular planning meeting. "Modern builders need business acumen, environmental awareness, client communication skills." Sarah nodded enthusiastically, adding notes to her ever-present folder. That's where George's experience comes in. 30 years of customer relations can't be taught from a textbook. The old garage was gradually taking shape. New windows had transformed the space, filling it with natural light. The concrete floor had been refinished, with clear zones marked out for different training areas. James's computer lab was coming together in the former parts room. Its clean lines and modern equipment, a striking contrast to the building's industrial heritage. Sophie had become a regular fixture at the site, arriving after nursery with Sarah to inspect the day's progress. Her workbench had been carefully preserved during the renovation, becoming a symbol of the center's multi-generational approach. "Look, Grandad," she called out one afternoon, proudly displaying a wooden birdhouse she and George had been working on. "We built it together." Marcus paused in his work, taking in the slightly crooked but carefully assembled structure. "That's beautiful craftsmanship, love. Shall we put it up in Sarah's garden? Next to Granny's roses," Sophie agreed seriously. "Trunk says the birds need a proper home too." The mention of his mother's roses, now flourishing along the newly laid pathway, still caught at Marcus's heart. Sarah had tended them with particular care during the renovation, protecting them from dust and debris, with the same dedication she'd shown in preserving family memories during the years of separation. One Saturday morning, as Marcus worked alone on fitting the new classroom door, he found himself studying old marks on the garage wall, heights of a growing boy, carefully penciled with dates. His father had measured him there every birthday until he was 16. Without conscious thought, he found himself adding a new mark. Sophie, age 312. "Room for plenty more measurements there," came George's voice from behind him. His father stood in the doorway, carrying 2 cups of tea. "Though we might need to start a new wall for all the students who'll come through here." They sat together on newly installed benches, watching early morning light filter through the skylights Marcus had insisted on adding. The space smelled of fresh paint and new timber rather than motor oil now, but somehow its heart remained unchanged. "Had a call from the Builders Federation yesterday," George mentioned, blowing on his tea. "They're interested in accrediting our courses. Seems our little family project is causing quite a stir in the industry." Marcus nodded, unsurprised. James's website had attracted significant attention with its blend of traditional values and modern approach. Sarah's careful business planning had impressed local authorities, resulting in several substantial grants. Even Sophie's presence on site had sparked discussions about making the construction industry more family-friendly. "We're still on track for the January opening?" Marcus asked, though he knew Sarah's schedule by heart. "Ahead of schedule, actually. Emma's firm has already enrolled 10 apprentices for the first program, and there's a waiting list for the weekend workshops." The sound of approaching voices interrupted their conversation. James and Emma arrived, followed by Sarah carrying boxes of new workwear embroidered with the center's logo. A simple design incorporating a trowel, a spanner, and a computer mouse representing the bridging of traditions. "Sophie helped choose the colors," Emma explained, holding up a navy blue jacket. "She insisted every student should have a proper uniform, just like her nursery." The morning evolved into an impromptu family gathering, with everyone pitching in to organize the new equipment and supplies. Sarah handled the inventory with meticulous care, while James and Emma set up the last of the computers. George regaled them with stories of the garage's early days, each tale adding another layer of history to the renovated space. As Marcus watched his family work together, he realized that they weren't just creating a training center, they were building a legacy. Every decision, from preserving the original workbench to incorporating the latest technology, reflected their commitment to honoring the past while embracing the future. Sophie's voice rang out across the workshop. "Daddy, can we take a picture? Trunk wants to remember this day." They gathered together near the main entrance, where Sarah's roses framed the new sign. Thompson Family Trade Center. Building skills, building futures. Emma set up her camera's timer and hurried to join them. Just before the shutter clicked, Marcus felt Sophie's small hand slip into his, while his father's arm wrapped around his shoulders. The moment captured everything they'd built together. Not just the physical structure, but the bridges between generations, the healing of old wounds, the foundation for future growth. In Sophie's other arm, Trunk the elephant watched over it all, a peculiar but fitting guardian of their family's new chapter. December arrived with a dusting of snow and growing anticipation. The Thompson Family Trade Center was nearly ready for its January launch, though Marcus found himself spending every spare moment perfecting small details. Today, he was installing the last of the heritage photographs along the main corridor, a visual timeline of the garage's evolution. "That one's my favorite," Sarah said softly, approaching with 2 steaming mugs. She pointed to a faded photograph of young Marcus and his father, both grinning proudly over a newly repaired engine. "You can see so much joy there." Marcus accepted the tea gratefully, studying the image. I'd forgotten how long Dad's hair was back then. He chuckled, then gestured to another photo nearby, this one recent, showing Sophie and George working on her birdhouse. Some things don't change though, that same look of concentration. The corridor had become a bridge between past and present. Alongside the old garage photos, James had added QR codes that linked to virtual tours and technical demonstrations. The blend of traditional photographs and modern technology perfectly captured their vision for the center. Emma appeared, carrying architectural plans for the next phase of development. "The council's approved the extension," she announced, spreading the drawings across a nearby workbench. "We can start work on the additional classrooms in spring." The center's reputation had grown even before its official opening. Word had spread through the construction industry about this unique family enterprise where traditional craftsmanship met modern innovation. The waiting list for courses now stretched months ahead. "We'll need more instructors," Sarah mused, reviewing her ever-present planning folder. "Marcus, what about that young woman who worked on the Manchester Cathedral restoration with you? Rachel?" "She'd be perfect," Marcus agreed. "Brilliant stonemason, and she's been wanting to get into teaching." He paused, remembering something. "She's got a young daughter too, about Sophie's age." Sarah's eyes lit up. "Perhaps we could look into creating a creche facility. There must be other parents in the industry who'd benefit from that." The idea sparked an animated discussion about making the construction trades more accessible to everyone. Emma began sketching possible layouts for a children's area, while Sarah calculated potential costs and benefits. Marcus watched them work together, marveling at how naturally his stepmother and daughter-in-law had bonded. Later that afternoon, George arrived with Sophie from nursery. She raced through the building, trunk bouncing along beside her, checking on all her favorite spots. The birdhouse she'd built with George had attracted its first residents, a pair of robins that Sophie had named Bob and Builder. "Grandad, come see," she called excitedly. "The birds are bringing stuff for their house just like we did." Marcus followed her to the window overlooking Sarah's garden. The roses, though dormant for winter, still stood proud along the pathway. Through the bare branches, they could see the robins flitting back and forth with building materials. "They're making it proper cozy," Sophie explained seriously. "Trunk says every home needs love built into it." Her words struck Marcus deeply. Looking around the center, he could see the love built into every detail. The carefully preserved workbench, the heritage wall, the modern additions that honored rather than erased the building's history. Even the new sign outside, with its simple but meaningful design, spoke of family unity and shared purpose. James joined them at the window, laptop in hand. "The virtual training modules are ready for testing," he announced. "Dad, could you review the bricklaying sequence? I want to make sure we've captured all the fine details." They spent the next hour going through the digital content James had created. Marcus found himself impressed by how well his son had translated physical skills into clear, engaging online lessons. The programs would allow students to practice techniques virtually before working with actual materials. "This would have been so useful when I was learning," George commented, watching a 3D animation of proper tool handling, though nothing beats hands-on experience. "That's why we're offering both," Emma explained. "The virtual modules support the practical training, but they don't replace it. It's about enhancing understanding, not shortcuts." As evening approached, Sarah called everyone to the break room, formerly the garage's tiny kitchen, now transformed into a comfortable gathering space. She'd prepared dinner in the new kitchenette, filling the center with homely aromas that reminded Marcus of Sunday roasts and family meals. "I've been thinking," Sarah said as they settled around the large table she'd insisted on installing. "We should have a proper celebration before the official opening, not just for potential clients and industry people, but for us, for family. Christmas is coming," Sophie piped up. "Could we have a tree here, with tools for decorations?" The suggestion prompted laughter and immediate planning. George offered to bring his collection of vintage tools to hang alongside modern ones. James and Emma began discussing lighting designs, while Sarah started listing potential guests. Marcus sat back, taking in the scene. His once empty life had become rich with family connections, each day bringing new opportunities for healing and growth. The center wasn't just a business venture or a training facility, it was physical proof that broken things could be rebuilt stronger than before. Sophie climbed onto his lap, trunk tucked securely under her arm. "We did good building, didn't we, Grandad?" "We did, love," he answered, hugging her close. "We built something very special indeed." The week before Christmas transformed the Thompson Family Trade Center into a wonderland of creativity. True to her word, Sophie had supervised the decoration of an enormous tree in the main workshop area, its branches adorned with a peculiar but charming mixture of vintage tools and modern building implements. George's old spirit level hung beside a state-of-the-art laser measure. Ancient wooden mallets shared space with miniature 3D printed replicas of power tools. At the top, Trunk the elephant presided over it all, wearing a tiny hard hat adorned with fairy lights. "It's perfect," Sarah declared, adjusting a garland made from measuring tapes. "Absolutely perfect." The center's first family celebration was scheduled for Christmas Eve, ahead of the official opening in January. The guest list had grown to include not just immediate family, but also key figures from their shared past. Old colleagues, trusted suppliers, and friends who had supported them through the years. Marcus spent the morning with James, putting final touches on the heritage wall. They'd added new photographs documenting the center's renovation, creating a continuous narrative of family history. The latest edition showed all three generations working together, George teaching Sophie to sandwood, while Marcus and James installed new equipment in the background. "I found something in the old office," James said, pulling a dusty envelope from his pocket. "Look." Inside was a Christmas card, never sent, dated 15 years ago. Marcus recognized Sarah's handwriting immediately. "Dear Marcus, I hope this finds you well. I want you to know." The message ended there, unfinished. "She tried to reach out so many times," James explained quietly, "but she was afraid of making things worse. We all were, I suppose." Marcus studied the card, thinking of all the unsent messages, the unspoken words that had filled those 15 years. "We can't change the past," he said finally, "but we're writing a new story now." The evening brought a light snowfall, dusting the center's new sign with white. Guests began arriving as dusk settled, their exclamations of surprise and delight echoing through the transformed space. Old-timers who remembered the original garage stood amazed at its evolution, while younger visitors admired the seamless blend of traditional craftsmanship and modern technology. Rachel, the stonemason Marcus had mentioned, arrived with her daughter Lucy, who immediately formed an alliance with Sophie. The two girls darted through the workshop, giving improvised tours to anyone who would listen, with Trunk providing expert commentary. Emma's corporate colleagues mingled with George's old mechanic friends, trading stories and perspectives on the changing face of construction. Sarah moved through the crowd with quiet pride, answering questions about their training programs and future plans. As the evening progressed, someone started playing Christmas carols on a portable speaker. The music mixed with conversation and laughter, filling the space with warmth. Marcus found himself by the heritage wall, watching his family interact with their guests. Sophie and Lucy had set up shop at the children's workbench, seriously explaining proper tool handling to an amused group of professionals. James and Emma demonstrated the virtual training modules, while George regaled younger builders with tales from his early days in the trade. Sarah appeared at Marcus's side, holding 2 cups of mulled wine. "Penny for your thoughts." "Just wondering what Mum would make of all this," he replied, accepting a cup. The old garage becoming a school, her roses blooming along the path. "She'd be proud," Sarah said softly. "Not just of the center, but of us, of how we found our way back to being a family." They stood in comfortable silence, watching Sophie lead Lucy to the Christmas tree to introduce her to Trunk. The girls' laughter carried across the workshop, bright and clear as bells. "You know," Sarah continued, "I used to dream about moments like this. Family gatherings, celebrations, watching the next generation grow up. But I thought I'd lost the chance when I drove you away." Marcus turned to her, seeing not the woman who had once seemed a threat, but someone who had carried hope through 15 years of separation. We all played a part in what happened, but we all played a part in fixing it too. Speaking of fixing things, George called, approaching with James and Emma. We've had an idea about the spring expansion. What if we added a special workshop space dedicated to repair and restoration, teaching people to fix things rather than replace them? The suggestion sparked an immediate discussion. Emma pulled out her ever-present tablet to sketch possibilities, while James began calculating space requirements. Sophie and Lucy wandered over, offering their own suggestions for the fixing room. As Marcus watched his family planning and dreaming together, he realized that the center had become more than just a training facility. It was a place of second chances, of bridges rebuilt and wounds healed, a place where the past was honored but not imprisoned by, where future generations could learn not just about building walls, but about building relationships. Outside, the snow continued to fall softly, covering the old and new in a clean white blanket. Through the window, Marcus could see the sleeping forms of Sarah's roses, waiting patiently for spring. Like the family itself, they had deep roots and the promise of new blooms to come. January arrived with purpose, bringing the long-anticipated opening of the Thompson Family Trade Center. The morning of the launch dawned clear and cold, frost patterns decorating the new windows like nature's stained glass. Marcus stood in the entrance hall before dawn, checking every detail one final time. The heritage wall told their story silently but powerfully, from the old garage photos to the recent Christmas celebration. Sarah's roses, though still winter dormant, stood proud along the pathway, promising spring renewal. "Can't sleep either," George's voice came from behind him. His father appeared with 2 steaming travel mugs of tea, looking smart in a new suit with the center's logo embroidered on the breast pocket. "Just making sure everything's perfect," Marcus replied, accepting the tea gratefully. "It already is perfect," George said softly, "because we built it together." The first staff meeting began at 7, gathered around the large table in the break room. Rachel, their new instructor, arrived early with Lucy in tow. The 2 girls immediately found each other, Sophie sharing Trunk's latest building adventures, while the adults reviewed the day's schedule. "The first group arrives at 9, Sarah announced, distributing printed itineraries. 15 students for the intensive course, plus 30 registered for the evening classes. Emma's firm has sent 5 apprentices, and we have 3 single parents taking advantage of the creche facility." James pulled up the digital registration system on his tablet. "The online modules have already had over 100 access requests. People are particularly interested in the virtual reality demonstrations." Emma adjusted her presentation notes. "We should emphasize the practical applications. Show them how traditional skills and modern technology complement each other." As the morning progressed, the center came alive. Sophie and Lucy helped Sarah arrange refreshments in the reception area, while George and Marcus conducted final equipment checks. James and Emma ensured all the digital systems were running smoothly, and Rachel prepared the practical demonstration area. The first students began arriving at 8:30, earlier than expected. They were a diverse group, young apprentices in fresh workwear, experienced traders looking to update their skills, parents returning to the industry after raising children. Each was greeted personally, given a welcome pack, and introduced to the center's unique family atmosphere. "This is my granddaughter Sophie," Marcus heard his father saying to a young mother with a toddler. "She and her friend Lucy are our resident junior consultants. They'll show your little one to our children's area." The official opening ceremony was scheduled for 10 o'clock. Local press had arrived, along with representatives from various trade organizations and educational bodies. Sarah had arranged everything meticulously, ensuring the center's message of family, innovation, and inclusivity came through clearly. Marcus found himself standing at the podium, looking out at the gathered crowd. His family flanked him supportively, George and Sarah to one side, James and Emma to the other, with Sophie and Lucy sitting cross-legged in the front row, trunk held high to see better. 15 years ago, Marcus began, his voice steady despite his nerves, "I walked away from this building and from my family. I thought some bridges couldn't be rebuilt once broken." He paused, looking at Sarah, who smiled encouragingly. "But as any good builder knows, sometimes what seems broken just needs the right tools, the right materials, and most importantly, the right people to help fix it. This center represents more than just a training facility. It's proof that with patience, understanding, and love, We can build something stronger than what was there before." The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur of speeches, ribbon cutting and applause. Soon the first classes were underway, the sound of instruction and learning filling every corner of the building. Rachel led a masterclass in stone carving, while James demonstrated the virtual reality training systems. George shared his decades of experience with eager apprentices, and Emma conducted workshops on project management. Sarah had transformed the old office into a comfortable observation room where parents could watch their children while studying. Through its windows, Marcus could see Sophie and Lucy showing younger children how to build with soft blocks, supervised by a qualified childcare worker. "It's amazing," a voice said beside him. He turned to find one of the students, a woman perhaps in her 30s. "I've wanted to retrain for years, but with 2 kids, I never thought it would be possible." "That's exactly why we created this place," Marcus replied. "Everyone deserves a chance to build their future." Later that afternoon, during a brief quiet moment, Marcus found himself back at the Heritage Wall. A new photograph had appeared, one he hadn't seen before. It showed him and Sarah at Christmas, heads bent together in conversation, both smiling. The caption read simply, "Building Bridges, Christmas 2024. "I hope you don't mind," Sarah said, appearing beside him. It seemed important to document that moment too. Marcus wrapped an arm around his stepmother's shoulders. "It's perfect," he said, "just like everything else you've helped build here." Through the window, they could see new students arriving for the evening classes, their excited voices carrying across the car park. Sophie and Lucy were helping George demonstrate proper tool storage, while James and Emma prepared for their joint presentation on digital integration in construction. The center hummed with activity, purpose, and possibility. Just like Sarah's roses waiting beneath the frost, new growth was ready to bloom. The Thompson Family Trade Center had opened its doors, not just to students, but to a future built on the strongest foundation of all, family. As winter gradually yielded to early spring, the Thompson Family Trade Center flourished beyond their highest expectations. Every day brought new stories of success, connection, and growth. The center had quickly become more than just a training facility. It was a community hub where lives were being transformed. Marcus found himself constantly amazed by the ways their family project touched others. One morning, he observed a grandmother and grandson working side by side in a weekend workshop, sharing skills across generations. Another day, he watched a single mother proudly demonstrate her newly acquired tiling technique while her daughter played safely in the creche with Sophie and Lucy. "We've had to start a waiting list for the advanced courses," Sarah announced during their weekly family meeting. The break room table was covered with papers, laptops, and the remains of a shared lunch. "And the online modules are accessing international students now." James nodded, pulling up the statistics on his tablet. "We've got people logging in from Australia, Canada, even Japan. They're particularly interested in the heritage restoration techniques Dad and Rachel teach." "Speaking of Rachel," Emma interjected, "her integration of traditional stonemasonry with modern scanning technology has caught the attention of several conservation bodies. They're interested in developing specialized courses." George beamed with pride, watching Sophie and Lucy demonstrate proper hammer technique to trunk on their workbench. "Who'd have thought our little family garage would reach so far?" The center's approach to inclusive training had created ripples throughout the industry. Other facilities were beginning to adopt their family-friendly policies, and larger companies were reconsidering their approach to work-life balance. Emma's firm had already implemented several of their innovations across their national training program. Sarah's garden had become an unexpected highlight of the center's success. As the first shoots of spring emerged, the roses began their annual awakening. New students often gathered there during breaks, finding inspiration in the carefully tended space that represented so much of their family's journey. "Mum would have loved all this," Marcus said one evening, helping Sarah plant new bulbs along the pathway, especially seeing Sophie following in the family tradition. "She's got your eye for detail," Sarah replied, watching their granddaughter carefully measure spacing between plantings, "and your father's patience for teaching." The mention of teaching brought a smile to Marcus's face. He'd discovered a natural talent for instruction, his years of experience translating easily into clear, engaging lessons. But more than that, he'd found healing in helping others build their own bridges, whether physical or metaphorical. That afternoon, the center hosted a special event, the graduation of their first cohort of intensive course students. The main workshop had been transformed for the occasion, tools carefully stored away to make room for chairs and a small stage. Sophie and Lucy had insisted on making certificates for everyone, complete with hand-drawn construction tools and liberal use of glitter. As Marcus watched the graduates receive their certifications, he reflected on how each person's journey mirrored his own family's story of reconstruction. There was Michael, a former office worker who'd found new purpose in heritage restoration. Jenny, a young mother returning to the trade after raising her children. Raj, whose traditional carpentry skills now merged seamlessly with digital design. "Would you ever have imagined this?" George asked quietly, standing beside him. "When you were learning your first tricks of the trade in the old garage?" Marcus shook his head, watching Sophie and Lucy proudly hand out their glitter-enhanced certificates. "I thought I was just learning to build walls. Turns out we were learning to build community all along." The graduation ceremony transitioned into an informal gathering, with families and friends joining the celebrations. James and Emma circulated with tablets, collecting testimonials for the website, while Sarah ensured everyone had refreshments. The center buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the sharing of future plans. Rachel approached Marcus, Lucy skipping alongside her. "The Heritage Restoration course is fully booked for the next term," she reported, "and 3 of today's graduates have already been hired by conservation projects." "Daddy," Sophie called, running up with trunk clutched tightly. "Can we show everyone the surprise now?" The surprise was a collaborative project the children had been working on, a scale model of the center, complete with tiny tools and miniature students, crafted during their supervised play sessions. It sat proudly on display, showing not just the building but the garden too, with little pipe cleaner roses climbing up matchstick trellises. "Look," Lucy pointed out earnestly, "we put everyone in it. There's Grandad George teaching, and Rachel doing stones, and Sarah in the garden. And Trunk supervising everything," Sophie added, making the adults laugh. As evening approached and the celebrations wound down, the family gathered in the break room for their traditional end-of-day tea. The setting sun painted the workshop in warm golden light, highlighting the heritage wall's photographs, now expanded to include images of their first graduating class. Marcus looked around at his family. George and Sarah discussing plans for the spring term, James and Emma reviewing the day's social media coverage, Sophie and Lucy teaching Trunk about proper certificate presentation. The center hummed with the echo of the day's celebrations, but more than that, it resonated with the strength of bonds rebuilt and dreams realized. "You know what?" he said, drawing everyone's attention. "I think we've built something that will last generations." Sophie looked up from her impromptu lesson with Trunk. "Just like the birds in their house, right, Grandad? Building homes that last." "Exactly like that, love," Marcus replied, remembering the simple birdhouse that had started so much. "Exactly like that." Spring arrived in full bloom at the Thompson Family Trade Center, Sarah's roses bursting with color along the entrance pathway. The morning sun cast long shadows through the workshop windows, where Marcus stood contemplating the changes of the past year. The heritage wall now told a story not just of the past, but of new beginnings. Today marked a special milestone. The center would host its first Family Skills Day, an event designed to bring multiple generations together to learn and share construction techniques. The idea had originated from Sophie and Lucy's endless questions about everyone's different roles in the center. "All set for the big day?" James appeared beside him, carrying 2 cups of coffee. The early morning light caught the silver threads beginning to appear in his dark hair, so like his father's had been at his age. "Just thinking," Marcus replied, accepting the coffee, "about how different things were a year ago. How empty everything felt." Before James could respond, the center's doors burst open as Sophie and Lucy raced in, followed by Emma carrying boxes of materials for the day's activities. The girls had grown noticeably over the past months, their confidence blooming alongside their knowledge of the trade. "Grandad," Sophie called out, Trunk tucked securely under her arm, wearing a newly crafted tool belt. "We made special badges for everyone coming today. Lucy designed them on Dad's computer." The badges, it turned out, featured a beautiful blend of hand-drawn tools and digital artwork, with the center's logo prominently displayed. Each one was personalized for the family attending, with space for 3 generations to write their names. Sarah arrived next, arms full of fresh flowers from the garden. "The roses outdid themselves this year," she said, arranging them in vases throughout the reception area. "Must be all the love in the air." The first families began arriving at 9, filling the center with excited chatter. Marcus watched as parents and grandparents settled in with their children, each generation bringing their own perspective to the trade. George had set up several workstations where families could work together on simple projects. "Remember when we built my first toolbox, Dad?" Marcus asked, joining his father at one of the stations. George smiled, demonstrating proper measuring technique to a young boy and his grandmother. "Like it was yesterday. Now look at you, teaching others to build their own futures." Rachel had organized a special stonework demonstration where 3 generations could work together to create a small garden feature. Lucy and Sophie appointed themselves assistant instructors, solemnly explaining the importance of safety gear to younger participants. James and Emma managed the digital aspects, showing how modern technology could enhance traditional skills. Their virtual reality station proved particularly popular, with grandparents especially amazed by the ability to practice techniques in a safe, virtual environment. "It's like magic," one elderly carpenter remarked, removing the VR headset, "but it doesn't replace the feel of real wood under your hands." "That's exactly our philosophy," Emma explained. "Technology supports tradition. It doesn't replace it." As the morning progressed, Marcus found himself drawn to the heritage wall. A new section had been added recently, displaying photographs from their first few months of operation. There were images of their opening day, the first graduation ceremony, and countless moments of learning and connection. One photo particularly caught his eye, a simple shot of Sophie and Lucy working at their bench, while he and Sarah tended the roses in the background. It captured everything the center had come to represent: family, growth, and the passing of knowledge between generations. Sarah joined him, her gardening apron dusted with soil from the morning's work. "I never properly thanked you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For giving us all a second chance. For being willing to rebuild what was broken." Marcus turned to his stepmother, seeing not the woman who had once seemed to threaten his place in the family, but the person who had kept hope alive through 15 years of separation. "I think we all built this together," he replied, "brick by brick, day by day." The sound of laughter drew their attention back to the main workshop. A young girl, no older than Sophie, had just successfully completed her first dovetail joint under George's patient guidance. Her parents and grandparents applauded, their faces glowing with shared pride. "You know what this reminds me of?" James asked, approaching with his tablet in hand. "Those Sunday afternoons in the old garage before everything fell apart. Everyone having their own task but working together." Marcus nodded, watching Sophie demonstrate proper hammer technique to a group of fascinated children, Trunk overseeing the lesson from his perch on the workbench. "We've come full circle," he said, "but we're better for the journey." As the day continued, more stories emerged, more connections were forged. Families shared not just skills, but histories, hopes, and dreams. The center hummed with the energy of multiple generations, learning and growing together, each contributing their own unique perspective to the trade. Rachel gathered everyone for a group photo near the end of the day, positioning them in front of the heritage wall. "For the next chapter of our story," she explained, setting up the camera. As Marcus stood there, surrounded by his family and the families they'd helped bring together, he realized that the Thompson Family Trade Center had become more than just a training facility. It was a living testament to the power of forgiveness, the strength of family bonds, and the endless possibilities that arise when people choose to build bridges instead of walls. Sophie tugged at his sleeve, her eyes bright with excitement. "Granddad," she whispered, "Trunk says we built something magical here." Looking around at all they'd created together, Marcus couldn't help but agree. The evening sun cast long shadows across the Thompson Family Trade Center's workshop as the last families from the Skills Day gathered their projects and said their goodbyes. The air hummed with the satisfaction of a day well spent, filled with the kind of joy that comes from creating something meaningful together. Marcus sat at Sophie's workbench, watching his family move through their end-of-day routines. George was carefully storing tools with a new young apprentice, sharing stories of his early days in the trade. Sarah and Emma arranged materials for the next day's classes, while James updated the center's social media with highlights from the event. Sophie and Lucy had fallen asleep on the break room sofa, Trunk nestled between them, their matching tool belts still fastened proudly around their waists. The girls had spent the day tirelessly sharing their knowledge with other children, their enthusiasm infectious and pure. "Penny for your thoughts?" Rachel asked, joining Marcus at the workbench. Her daughter Lucy had become as much a part of the family as the center itself, her bond with Sophie growing stronger with each passing day. "Just thinking about foundations," Marcus replied. "How the strongest ones aren't always visible from the outside." The heritage wall caught the evening light, its photographs telling their family's story of separation and reunion, of bridges broken and rebuilt. But it told other stories too, of students finding new paths, of families growing closer through shared learning, of a community built on understanding and support. Sarah appeared with a tray of tea, setting it down carefully beside them. "The roses are starting to bloom earlier this year," she observed, as if they know they're part of something special. "Everything's blooming here," Emma added, joining them with James. "The waiting list for courses keeps growing, and we've had inquiries about setting up similar centers in other cities." George approached, carrying a small wooden box that Marcus recognized immediately, his first toolbox, built under his father's guidance all those years ago. "Found this while organizing the storage room," he said, setting it down gently. "Thought it might be time to pass it on." Inside, the tools were well worn but carefully maintained, each one holding memories of lessons learned and skills gained. Marcus ran his fingers along the beveled edge of the box, remembering the patience it had taken to get the joints just right. "Sophie's about the age you were when we made this," George continued softly. "Maybe it's time for her to start her own collection." The mention of her name stirred Sophie slightly. She blinked awake, careful not to disturb Lucy, and made her way to the workbench. "Is that a treasure box, Grandad?" "Something like that, love," Marcus replied, lifting her onto his lap. "It's a box of beginnings." The family gathered around as Marcus showed Sophie each tool, sharing the stories behind them. Sarah produced photos from the early days of the garage, while George added his own memories of teaching his son. James and Emma listened intently, recording these precious moments for their digital archive. "Can Lucy and I make our own boxes?" Sophie asked, examining the dovetail joints with careful fingers. "Of course," George replied. "That's what this place is all about, building new traditions while honoring the old ones." As if to emphasize his point, a family of robins flew past the window, returning to the birdhouse Sophie and George had built together. The simple structure had become home to generations of birds, much as the center had become a home for generations of builders. "We should document this moment," James suggested, reaching for his camera. But before he could take the photo, Sophie held up her hand. "Wait, everyone needs to be in it, even Trunk." She arranged them carefully around the workbench, positioning her elephant friend to oversee the scene. The camera's timer counted down, capturing the Thompson family in a moment of perfect unity. 3 generations gathered around a simple wooden toolbox, their faces reflecting the joy of being together, of building something lasting. Marcus looked around at his family, at Sarah, who had kept faith through 15 years of separation, at George, whose wisdom and patience had helped rebuild more than just walls, at James and Emma, whose vision had brought new life to old traditions, at Rachel and Lucy, who had become such integral parts of their story, and at Sophie, who represented all their hopes for the future. The Thompson Family Trade Center stood as testament to their journey, not just a place of learning, but a symbol of how love, forgiveness, and dedication could transform broken foundations into something stronger and more beautiful than before. Sophie picked up a small hammer from her grandfather's old toolbox, testing its weight in her hand. "When can we start building, Grandad?" Marcus smiled, remembering asking his own father the same question many years ago. "We already have, love," he replied. "We've been building something wonderful all along." As the evening light faded and stars began to appear through the workshop windows, the Thompson family sat together, sharing stories and dreams, their laughter echoing through the space they'd created. The center had become more than any of them had imagined. It was a bridge between past and future, a foundation for generations to come. And in Sarah's garden, the roses bloomed under the starlight, their petals carrying the promise of tomorrow's growth, tomorrow's possibilities, tomorrow's stories waiting to be built.